Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. Man, I appreciate you being with me so very, very much. And as I have been saying, thank you so much for tuning in on an increasing number, getting an increasing number of views, getting an increasing number of comments, and what have you. And that's just so gratifying. And I do appreciate that so very much. And as I've pointed out, the fact that I'm getting more views on YouTube is absolutely indicative that the program as a whole is getting more views. You see, as I've shared with you, the viewership count on YouTube is just a super tiny little sliver of the potential audience that we have here on Now TV. Now TV now has a potential reach of hundreds of millions of people. Do you catch the power of that? That is so exciting. And so, once again, I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank you for sharing the word about this program and about what we are trying to accomplish. We're trying to help the church correct a massive weakness, a chink in the armor, so to speak, that has plagued the church for centuries, literally for centuries. And that is the challenge of Christ. Remember, John chapter 10, verse 37. Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. And as I've shared with you before, ladies and gentlemen, that challenge is unique in the theological world, in the religious world. Just recently, we have seen the overtaking of Afghanistan by the Taliban. You know and I know that as a result of that, currently, right now, in Afghanistan, if you dare to take a view in any way opposed to their view of Islam, you will die. They're not interested in dialogue. They're not interested in discussion. They are interested in one thing: total domination. And domination through violence and murder, if need be. And so they're not interested in the challenge of Christ. They simply dismiss Christ as a false teacher. I sat and watched, and of course, Louis Farrakhan is not a member of that brand of Islam, but he is nonetheless the head of a massive organization which is militantly opposed to Jesus Christ. I sat and watched him give a lesson, if you want to call it that, in which he called Jesus a false prophet, called him a liar, called him a, quote, filthy dog that needs to be rejected by everyone. And what was stunning to me, what was disturbing to me, there was a row of, quote, Christian ministers, an entire front row, Christian ministers. These are supposedly men who believe in Jesus as the Son of God, who believe that Jesus is the only answer to man's sin. And as Farrakhan was going through his diatribe against Jesus as a filthy dog, as a liar, as a false prophet, the camera panned this entire line of Christian, I use that term loosely, ministers. Not one of them flinched. Not one of them shook their head no in disagreement. Not one of them had any kind of facial expression of disagreement whatsoever. Not one of them even went. If you were to go by their facial expression, by their body language, you would think they agreed with Louis Farrakhan. You know what I suggest? I suggest to you that those men, unless they were great at hiding their emotions unless they were really, really good at hiding their disagreement. I suggest to you that many of those men had fallen for the claim that Jesus really is a false prophet. A very, very quick anecdote. Some years ago when I lived in Shawnee, Oklahoma, we had a copier repairman, good guy. I really, really enjoyed visiting with him. And he walked into my office one day, and he looked downtrodden, he looked whipped, he looked sad, and I've forgotten his name now. It was a long, long time ago. But I called his name, and I said, "Hey, man, what in the world's going on?" I said, "You look like you just lost your best friend." And he goes, "Don, I may have." He said, several weeks ago, we had a new preacher. And he said, he stood up in the pulpit and he was talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And he said, now, virtually everyone knows and understands Jesus was not actually raised from the dead. But that's not what is really important. What is actually important is that we believe that he was. And this guy, I'll just call him Bill for convenience. Bill said, "Don, I looked around at the people around me. I could not believe what I was hearing. I was hearing a man who claims to be a Christian say, we all know Jesus wasn't literally raised from the dead. What's important is that we believe he was." And he said, "Don, I was literally staggered. I was like, how could anybody say such a thing?" And he said, "I didn't see one person going, 'What? What?'" And he said, a couple of weeks passed, and he said, prior to service one morning, Sunday morning, I came up on the preacher and I said, "Hey, minister, how you doing, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "Hey, I've got a question. What was the response to your sermon a couple of weeks ago?" He said, "Oh, it was absolutely fantastic." He said, "Everybody said it was the most wonderful lesson they had ever heard." And Bill goes, "So when you said, we all know that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, all that matters is that we believe he was, nobody challenged that? Nobody disagreed with that?" And he said, "Oh, absolutely not." He said, "Matter of fact, that was one of the comments that drew the most praise." And he goes, "Well, I don't agree with that." And the preacher was just real flippant and said, "Well, that's okay." And again, quote, Bill, unquote, he said, "Don, there's something wrong here." And I said, "Well, yeah. Paul said, if Christ is not risen, your faith is in vain." Now, I didn't use the terminology of the challenge of Christ, but that is exactly what Bill and his congregation were being confronted with. And here was a, quote, Christian minister, unquote, that was telling them Jesus Christ himself failed his own challenge. All that really matters is that we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. It doesn't matter whether or not he was. You know, folks, listen to me. That's like saying, it's not really important whether or not you got $1 million in the bank. What's really important is that you believe that you do. See where that gets you in this world. Folks, you know and I know that is absolutely ridiculous. This is the challenge of Christ. Now, I have been sharing with you over the last several weeks the challenge of Christ in regard to his personal ministry. Jesus came to be king. He came to establish the kingdom. Our dispensational friends agree with that. They teach that. But they tell us, as a result of the Jewish rejection and rebellion, God had to withdraw the kingdom offer. And he had to establish the church as an emergency interim measure until such time when, he will rapture the church off of the earth and once again begin to deal with Israel as his exclusive people. The church is not on earth at all during the tribulation period after the rapture and until the millennium. Church is not on earth at all. You really need to get a copy of my little book, Leaving the Rapture Behind, in which I completely dispel the rapture doctrine. It's an inexpensive book. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and order that book. And you will be absolutely thrilled that you did. I want to tell you, I have had people who were dispensationalists for 20, 30, even 40 years tell me that little book, less than 60 pages, turned their dispensational world upside down. So, it may be challenging to you. It may be. But it may also set you free. So I've been sharing with you the idea of the challenge of Christ in regard to the dispensational claim that God inserted so far a 2,000-year gap between the end of the 69th week and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9. Now, I've written a couple of books on Daniel, Seal it, Vision, and Prophecy. 70 weeks are determined for the resurrection, and the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, future or fulfilled. You need to avail yourself of those books. So, the great question is there a gap of so far 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9? And let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Ice, with whom I've had 4 debates, and he refuses to debate me again now. Thomas Ice says, if there is no 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9, dispensationalism falls to the ground. And you can go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and you can read a series of articles that I wrote. Is there a gap in Daniel 9? And you can also purchase the DVDs of my debates with Thomas Ice that was held in Florida in 2003, in which I incorporated the material that I'm sharing with you now here on Now TV. You can own your own copy of the DVD. You can even get a digital download purchase at a reduced price through my website. So go there and take advantage of that. Now, over the last few weeks, I have shared with you the syllogistic, the logical argument, if there is or if there is not a gap of so far 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel, then certain things follow. Now, this is known in the world of logic as the modus potens, sometimes called modus ponens, but modus podens, either one, okay? It is known as the if-then form of argumentation. Perfectly valid, recognized by all logicians, recognized by virtually all scholars. I had a guy with whom I've been in a formal written debate on the dating of Revelation, which, by the way, is posted on my website. And he said I was using a logical fallacy by saying, well, if A is true, then B is true. And I wrote back and I said, well, if it's wrong to say if A is true, then B is true, then Paul the Apostle was wrong. Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul uses the modus ponens argument, form of argumentation, over and over and over again. If Christ is not risen, your faith is in vain. If Christ is not risen, we the apostles are found to be false witnesses. If the dead are not raised, you are yet in your sin. You see, folks, Paul said, if A is true, then B is true. So when I pointed out that according to this fella, and he's got a doctorate, he's a professor at a university, and yet he made this astounding argument that the modus ponens form of argumentation is a logical fallacy. Well, then you're going to have to accuse Paul of being guilty of a logical fallacy. It was just utterly amazing how this, quote, professor, unquote, could make such an ill-grounded and ill-founded claim. So, we return to the question now, if there was a gap of so far 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9, what are the implications of that? Well, let me remind you of what I shared in last week's program. All right? This is, if there is a gap, chart number 3. All right? If there is a gap in Daniel chapter 9 of so far 2,000 years, then if Jesus offered the kingdom to Israel, and he most assuredly did, and the dispensationalists agree with that, then Israel couldn't even have accepted the offer. Why? Well, because there's a gap. In other words, if I were to approach you and to say, hey, I got a cup of coffee for you here, and you reach out to get it, and you go, no, I don't mean you can take the cup of coffee now. In about 30 or 40 years, I'll give you a cup of coffee. What? You see, ladies and gentlemen, when the dispensationalist admits that Jesus came to offer the kingdom, when the dispensationalists admit Jesus offered the kingdom, then we have the right to ask, okay, since Jesus offered the kingdom, could the Jews have accepted that offer in the first century? Thomas Ice, in the book End Time Controversy, says, yes, the Jews could have accepted the kingdom offer in the first century, which, by the way, raises a really serious question, doesn't it? If the Jews could have accepted the kingdom offer in the first century, then that means they would not have rejected him, meaning they would not have put him to death. So if the Jews would have accepted the kingdom offer that Jesus made legitimately, honestly, actually, in the first century, then had the Jews accepted the offer, Jesus would never had died for our sins. Do you catch the power of that? So on the one hand, the dispensationalists tell us, oh, absolutely, Jesus came to establish the kingdom. Jesus offered the kingdom legitimately, honestly. The Jews could have accepted that offer. But if the Jews would have accepted the offer, then their rebellion and unbelief would not have been present, but it was their rebellion and unbelief that caused Jesus to be put on the cross. It was the Jewish rebellion and unbelief that caused them to cry out, crucify him, and we have no king but Caesar. It was that unbelief and rebellion that caused Pilate to put Jesus on the cross. So, once again, ladies and gentlemen, had the Jews accepted the offer, Jesus would not have died. But wait a minute. If it's true that Jesus legitimately, truly offered the kingdom, and if it's true that there was actually a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week, remember, of 2,000 years, then the Jews could not legitimately accept the offer because there was that 2,000-year gap between, hey, I'm going to give you a cup of coffee. Oh, okay, we'll take that. No, I don't mean right now. I mean in 2,000 years, I'll give you a cup of coffee. Now, folks, you want to talk about a fallacy. You want to talk about illogic. This is absolutely astounding. So, to conclude chart number 3 once again, if there is a gap in Daniel chapter 9 between the 69th and 70th week of so far 2,000 years, then if Jesus offered the kingdom, Israel could not have accepted it because the prophecy of the kingdom was not truly for Jesus' generation. Jesus could not legitimately offer the kingdom to them at that time, and thus, once again, they could not even accept it at that time. Now, remember, as I've shared with you, when I shared this information in that formal public debate with Thomas Ice and Mark Hitchcock, you should have seen their body language. They were sitting there, just absolutely staring straight ahead. They had never heard anything like this in all of their life. They literally refused initially to say one word about it. They kind of glanced at one another out of the corner of their eyes like, "You going to say something?" No, I'm not going to say anything. You say something. Until the moderator of the debate said, "Hey, brethren, would you want to comment on that?" And they both said, No, we don't have anything to say about that because we didn't hear a single verse quoted. Well, I did quote a verse, Daniel chapter 9, and I simply pointed out if what these men were saying is true, then logically, of necessity, what the chart said has to be true. Okay, chart number 4. Instead of saying if there is a gap, then this follows. Let's examine the question of if there is not a gap of so far 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week, then Jesus was absolutely right to say that the kingdom of heaven was at hand, and that means unequivocally the end of the 70th week was at hand. Okay? Follow me again. I got to read that again. If there is no gap between the 69th and the 70th week, then Jesus was right to say the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. And if Jesus was right to say the kingdom had drawn near, that means the end of the 70th week was truly, honestly, objectively at hand. Well, dispensationalists like to say, well, it was. It was truly at hand. It was truly near when Jesus offered the kingdom. Well, no, it wasn't, ladies and gentlemen. It wasn't objectively near. Because remember, dispensationalists tell us there's a 2,000-year gap in Daniel 9. So if there's a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week, according to the dispensationalists, then when Jesus appeared at the end of the 69th week, the kingdom was not at hand. It was not near. The time was not fulfilled. So consider the following. So if there is no gap of so far 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9, meaning that Jesus was right, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is drawn near. Pay very careful attention. You must catch the power of this. Let me start over. If there is no gap between the 69th and the 70th week, meaning that Jesus was absolutely, totally correct and true and right when he said the kingdom of heaven is drawn near, then if the kingdom was not established within that at hand, soon, shortly time frame, then Daniel's prophecy failed. Jesus lied, and God failed. Now look, ladies and gentlemen, if we admit, as dispensationalists do, the prophetic countdown was right on schedule, right down to Jesus' day, right on schedule. And Jesus came just the right time. And Jesus came and proclaimed the time was right. And Jesus came and truly, objectively extended the kingdom offer to be their king and to establish the kingdom. So everything was right on schedule. And then, of course, we're told that the Jewish rebellion, which, by the way, was foretold in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, Messiah shall be cut off. Why would he be cut off? Because of the Jewish unbelief. So as I pose, how could the Jewish unbelief and rebellion cause the countdown to be postponed when the Jewish rejection of Jesus and his death is part of the actual countdown? But ladies and gentlemen, let me read this one more time. If there is no gap, and Jesus was right, the kingdom of heaven is drawn near, then if the kingdom was not established within that at hand short period of time, then Daniel's prophecy failed. Why? Because if the time was right, guess what? There's no failure. And there was no gap. And I'm out of time. See you next week.